The wagon did not slow down. It did not stop. The woman who had promised to care for her simply looked away. And 10-year-old Lena watched the only home she had ever known disappear into the dust. She stood there on that forest trail with nothing but crumbs in her trembling hand, barefoot, starving, alone. They called her dead weight. They called her a burden. They threw her away like garbage in the middle of nowhere and left her to die. But here is what Martha Greer did not know. That same trail would lead the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties straight to that little girl. And what happened next would turn the throwaway child into the most powerful woman the West had ever seen. She did not just survive. She did not just get revenge. She built an empire. And she made every single person who abandoned her regret it for the rest of their lives. If you want to see how one little girl's tragedy became the greatest redemption story ever told, stay with me until the very end. Trust me, you do not want to miss how this ends. This story will teach you one powerful truth. Your worth does not come from other people. It comes from you, from what you choose to do with the life you have been given. Being thrown away is not the end of your story. It is just the beginning. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they matter. And if you have not subscribed yet, make sure you do so. You never miss another story that will touch your heart and change your life. Now let us begin. The morning sun rose blood red over the Montana territory. It painted the sky in shades of warning that no one bothered to heed. It was the summer of 1887. The land stretched endless and unforgiving beneath a heaven that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Lena Crow sat in the back of the wagon with her knees pulled tight against her chest. She made herself as small as possible. She had learned long ago that small things were harder to notice, and things that were not noticed were less likely to be hurt. The wooden planks beneath her were rough and splintered, but she did not shift or complain. Complaining was dangerous. Complaining made people remember you existed. The wagon belonged to Martha Greer, a woman with hands like leather and eyes like winter ice. Martha ran a small farm 3 towns back. She had taken Lena in 8 months ago when the orphanage in Helena had closed its doors for good. Charity case. That is what Martha had called her to the neighbors, another mouth to feed. But the Lord asks sacrifice of us all. But there had been no charity in Martha's house. There had been work, endless back-breaking work that started before dawn and ended long after dark. There had been scraps of food eaten standing up in the corner of the kitchen while Martha's own children sat at the table laughing. There had been a bed made of old grain sacks in a corner of the barn where Lena slept curled up against the cold while rats scratched in the walls around her. And now there was this. The wagon had been moving since before sunrise. It headed deeper into the wilderness along a trail Lena did not recognize. She had not asked where they were going. Questions invited anger, and anger invited pain. So she sat in silence. She watched the trees grow thicker. She watched the sky grow smaller. And she waited. Martha's husband, Silas, drove the wagon with his shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed straight ahead. He was a thin man with a thin voice. He never spoke to Lena at all. She might have been invisible to him. A ghost riding in the back of his wagon. And perhaps that was exactly what he wanted her to be. The trail narrowed, the trees pressed closer, and still the wagon moved forward, deeper into nowhere. It was nearly noon when Martha finally spoke. "Stop here." Silas pulled the horses to a halt without a word. The wagon creaked and groaned as it settled. For a long moment there was no sound, but the wind moving through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Lena's heart began to beat faster. She did not know why. But something in the air had changed, something that tasted like danger. Martha climbed down from the wagon seat. Her boots hit the packed earth with a heavy thud. She walked around to the back where Lena sat, and she stood there for a moment. looking at the girl with an expression that Lena could not read. "Get out." Lena did not move. Her body had frozen, locked in place by an instinct older than thought. She had learned to recognize the moments before something bad happened, the way the air seemed to thicken, the way time seemed to slow. And she recognized that moment now. "I said get out. I said get—" Martha's voice was harder now, edged with impatience. "Do not make me say it again. Slowly, carefully." Lena uncurled herself and climbed down from the wagon. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she forced them to hold steady. She was wearing the same dress she had worn for the past 3 months, a faded gray thing that had once belonged to Martha's daughter. It had been thrown to Lena when it became too stained and torn for anyone else to want. Her feet were bare. She had never been given shoes. Martha reached into the wagon and pulled out a small bundle, a handkerchief tied around something that crinkled like paper. She thrust it toward Lena, and Lena took it automatically. Her fingers closed around the rough fabric. "There is bread in there," Martha said, "and some cheese. It should last you a day or two if you are careful." Lena stared at the bundle in her hands. Her mind was working slowly, putting together pieces that did not want to fit. Bread, cheese, a day or two. "I do not understand," she whispered. Martha's face did not change. "What is there to understand? You are staying here. This is where you belong now. This is where you stay." The words hit Lena like a physical blow. She stumbled backward. Her heel caught on a root. She barely kept herself from falling. Staying here. But there is nothing here. There is no house. There is no family. There is nothing. "I know what there is and is not." Martha cut her off. "Do not you think I know? This is where you belong now." "But why?" The word tore itself from Lena's throat before she could stop it. "What did I do?" "I did everything you asked. I worked every day. I never complained. I never caused any trouble." "You never stopped being a burden," Martha said coldly. "You think food grows from nothing. You think there is endless room at my table. The crops failed this year. The well is running dry. I have got 3 children of my own to feed, and I cannot afford to keep carrying dead weight." Dead weight. The words burned in Lena's chest like hot coals. She had worked harder than anyone. She had done everything, been everything they wanted her to be, and still it was not enough. Still she was nothing. "Please," Lena heard herself say. The word came out thin and broken, the plea of a child who already knew she was begging for nothing. "Please, I will work harder. I will eat less. I will not be any trouble, I promise. Just please do not leave me here. Enough." Martha turned away, dismissing Lena's words like she was swatting at a fly. "This is done. I have made my decision. You will be fine out here. Someone will come along eventually. Someone always does." She climbed back onto the wagon seat beside Silas. He still had not turned around, still had not looked at the girl they were abandoning in the middle of nowhere. Martha picked up the reins and clicked her tongue. The horses began to move. Lena stood frozen in the middle of the trail, watching the wagon pull away. The bundle of food hung limp in her hands. The dust rose around her ankles like a shroud. She should run after them. She should scream, cry, throw herself at the wagon wheels and beg them to stop. That is what a child was supposed to do when they were being abandoned. That is what the moment called for. But Lena did not move. She did not cry. She did not make a sound, because experience had taught her something that no child should ever have to learn. Begging only deepens the hurt. Running after people who do not want you only makes the leaving worse. The people who abandon you do not look back, and if you force them to, they will only hate you for it. So she stood there in silence, her bare feet planted in the dirt. And she watched the wagon until it disappeared around a bend in the trail, until the sound of the wheels faded into nothing. And then she was alone. The forest pressed in around her like a living thing, vast and indifferent and full of shadows. The trail stretched ahead and behind, a thin line carved through the wilderness, leading nowhere she wanted to go. Lena looked down at the bundle in her hands. Bread and cheese. A day or two of survival. Martha had said it as if that made what she had done acceptable. As if a handful of food could balance out leaving a child alone in the wilderness to die. Because that is what this was. Lena understood that now with a clarity that cut through the shock and the hurt and the hollow ache of abandonment. Martha had not left her here to be found. Martha had left her here to disappear. Out of sight. Out of mind. Out of the way. One less mouth to feed. One less burden to carry. Dead weight. Lena's hands tightened on the bundle until her knuckles went white. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to throw the food into the trees and rage at the unfairness of a world that had never once been kind to her. But she did not. Instead, she took a deep breath, held it until her lungs burned, and then let it out slowly. There was no point in anger. There was no point in grief. Both were luxuries that belonged to people who had something left to lose. She had nothing. She was nothing. And somehow she had to find a way to survive. The first thing was water. Lena knew that much from the fragments of wisdom she had gathered over the years, pieced together from overheard conversations and half-remembered lessons. A person could live for weeks without food, but only days without water. If she was going to make it through this, she needed to find something to drink. She tilted her head, listening. The forest was full of sounds, birds calling, branches creaking, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. And beneath it all, so faint, she almost missed it, the distant murmur of running water. Lena started walking. The trail was easier to follow than the forest floor, so she stayed on it, moving in the direction of the sound. Her bare feet had long since grown tough from months of going without shoes, but the stones and roots still bit into her soles. She had to pick her path carefully to avoid the worst of them. As she walked, she thought about how she had come to this moment. She had been born in a mining town called Copper Ridge, or so she had been told. Her mother had died in childbirth, and her father, Thomas Crow, had tried his best for 6 years before a tunnel collapse had taken him too. After that, there had been the orphanage in Helena, a grim building full of grim children overseen by grim women who saw their charges as a duty rather than a calling. She had stayed there for 3 years, watching other children get adopted while she remained behind. She was too quiet, the matron said, too strange, too difficult to place. Families wanted cheerful children, easy children, children who smiled and laughed and did not look at them with eyes too old for their faces. When the orphanage closed due to lack of funding and lack of interest and lack of anyone who cared, the remaining children had been farmed out to whoever would take them. Some went to families who wanted helpers. Some went to businesses looking for cheap labor. And Lena had gone to Martha Greer, who had taken her for the work she could do and discarded her the moment that work was no longer worth the cost. It was a familiar story. It was her story. And now apparently her story was ending on a nameless trail in the middle of nowhere, unless she refused to let it end. The sound of water grew louder as she walked. Soon she could see it. A small creek cutting through the forest, its surface glittering in the patches of sunlight that filtered through the trees. Lena hurried toward it, her throat suddenly aching with thirst. She dropped to her knees beside the bank. The water was cold and clear. She drank deeply, cupping it in her hands and bringing it to her mouth again and again, until her stomach sloshed and her thirst finally began to ease. Then she sat back on her heels and looked around, taking stock of her situation. She was alone. She was lost. She had no shelter, no weapons, no way to protect herself from the predators that surely roamed these woods. She had a handful of food that would last a day or two at most. And after that, she would have to find a way to feed herself or starve. The odds were not in her favor. A more experienced person might have despaired. A younger child might have broken down entirely, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she faced. But Lena Crow was neither experienced nor young in the ways that mattered. She was somewhere in between, caught in the narrow space where survival instinct met stubborn determination. And she had decided somewhere in the past hour that she was not going to die on this trail. Not today. Not like this. Not alone and forgotten and unmourned. She would survive. She did not know how yet. But she would figure it out. She had always figured it out before. The afternoon passed slowly. Lena stayed near the creek, reasoning that water was the most valuable resource she had found and that straying too far from it would be foolish. She explored the immediate area carefully, looking for anything that might be useful. She found a small hollow beneath an overhang of rock, barely large enough for her to squeeze into. But protected from the wind and hidden from casual view, it was not much. But it was something. A place to sleep, a place to hide, a place that was hers alone. She gathered leaves and pine needles and piled them inside the hollow, creating a rough bed that was better than the grain sack she had slept on at Martha's farm. She collected stones from the creek and arranged them in a circle, remembering something she had once heard about fire pits. She did not know how to start a fire, had never been allowed near the matches at the farm. But perhaps she could figure it out. Perhaps there was a way. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Lena sat beside her little camp and opened the bundle Martha had given her. Inside, wrapped in a stained handkerchief, she found a heel of stale bread and a small wedge of cheese that had already begun to sweat in the heat. It was not much. It was barely anything at all. But it was more than she had had on many days at the farm. And she ate it slowly, savoring each bite, making it last. When she was finished, she carefully folded the handkerchief and tucked it into her pocket. It was dirty and worn, but it was hers now, one of the only things in the world that belonged to her alone. The shadows lengthened, the air grew cool. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lena crawled into her hollow beneath the rock and curled into a ball, pulling her thin dress tight around her. She was alone. She was afraid. She was a 10-year-old girl who had been thrown away like garbage, left to die in the wilderness by people who had never seen her as human. But she was alive. She had water. She had shelter. She had the stubborn, burning determination to see another sunrise. And somewhere in the darkness she heard something that made her blood run cold, the distant howl of wolves, rising and falling like a song of hunger. Lena pressed her back against the cold stone and closed her eyes. She did not pray, had stopped believing in prayers long ago, but she made herself a promise instead, fierce and silent and unbreakable. She would not die here. She would not let them win. She would survive this night and the next after that. And someday, somehow, she would prove to everyone who had ever abandoned her that she was worth more than they could possibly imagine. It was a child's promise, desperate and defiant and probably impossible. But it was all she had left. Morning came slowly, gray and misty and cold. Lena woke to the sound of birds singing and the ache of muscles that had spent the night pressed against hard ground. She was stiff and sore. Her stomach growled with hunger. But she was alive. She had survived her first night alone. She crawled out of her hollow and stretched, wincing at the protest of her body. The world around her was draped in fog, the trees emerging like ghosts from the whiteness. And for a long moment she simply stood there, breathing in the damp air and letting the reality of her situation wash over her again. She was still alone. She was still lost. Nothing had changed. But she was still alive. And that was something. She made her way to the creek and drank deeply, then splashed cold water on her face to chase away the last cobwebs of sleep. She had no food left. The bread and cheese were gone. But she remembered seeing berries growing along the trail yesterday, and she thought she might be able to find more if she looked. The fog began to lift as the sun rose higher. Lena set out to explore her surroundings more thoroughly. She moved carefully, staying close to the creek so she could find her way back, keeping her eyes open for anything edible. She found blackberries first, growing in a thick tangle along the water's edge. They were small and tart, not quite ripe, but she ate them anyway, stuffing her mouth full until her fingers were stained purple and her stomach had stopped cramping with hunger. It was not much, but it was enough to keep her going for another day. She was walking back toward her camp when she heard something that made her freeze in her tracks. Hoofbeats. Someone was coming. Lena's first instinct was to hide. She had learned long ago that strangers were dangerous, that people who came looking for lost children rarely had good intentions. But something made her hesitate. Maybe curiosity, maybe hope, maybe just the desperate loneliness of a child who had been alone for too long. She stepped off the trail and crouched behind a thick bush, peering through the leaves at the path ahead. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, and then a figure emerged from the trees. It was a man on horseback. He was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting straight in the saddle with the easy confidence of someone who had spent their whole life on horseback. His clothes were practical but well-made, not the patched and faded garments of a farmer, but the sturdy canvas and leather of a rancher. His face was weathered by sun and wind, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth. His hair was dark, shot through with gray. He rode alone, no wagon, no companions, and his eyes scanned the trail ahead with a quiet alertness that suggested he missed nothing. Lena held her breath as he approached, willing herself to be invisible. She was just a shadow in the brush, just a trick of the light, just nothing at all. The horse stopped. The man turned his head slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at the bush where Lena was hiding. "I know you are there," he said. His voice was low and calm, without threat or anger. "Saw your tracks in the mud back a ways. Small feet, no shoes. You have been out here at least a day, maybe more." Lena did not move, did not breathe. "I am not looking for trouble," the man continued, "just passing through. But if you are hurt or hungry, I have got food in my saddlebag. Water, too." Silence. The man waited. He did not push, did not demand, did not try to flush her out of her hiding place. He just sat there on his horse, patient as stone, letting the offer hang in the air between them, and slowly, reluctantly. Lena rose from behind the bush. She stepped onto the trail with her chin lifted and her shoulders squared. Meeting the stranger's gaze with defiance she did not entirely feel. She was filthy and ragged, her dress torn and her feet caked with mud, but she refused to cringe or cower. She had been abandoned, not defeated. The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he nodded. "How old are you?" he asked. 10. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "Almost 11. You alone out here?" The question should have been simple, but it carried weight, the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had been done to her, everything she had lost. "Yes," she finally said. "I am alone." The man did not ask why. He did not demand her story or press for details she was not ready to give. He just reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a wrapped bundle, and held it out toward her. "Biscuits," he said. "Made them this morning. They are still warm." Lena stared at the bundle. Her stomach growled so loudly she was sure he could hear it. But she did not move to take the food. "What do you want?" she asked. "What do you want for them?" Something flickered across the man's face. Surprise, maybe. Or sadness. "Nothing," he said. "I do not want anything. You are hungry. I have food. That is all. Nobody gives something for nothing. Some people do." He set the bundle on the ground in front of her and pulled back, giving her space. "I will leave them there. You can take them or not. Your choice." Lena looked at the bundle, looked at the man, looked back at the bundle. Her whole life, people had wanted things from her. Work, obedience, silence, invisibility. Every gift had come with strings attached. Every kindness had been a debt to be repaid. She had learned to be suspicious of generosity, to look for the hidden cost in every offered hand. But she was so hungry, and the biscuits smelled so good. Slowly, carefully, She bent down and picked up the bundle. She unwrapped it with trembling fingers and found 3 golden biscuits inside. Still faintly warm from the morning's fire, she bit into one, and the taste was so good. Butter and salt and simple, honest bread, that her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. The man watched her eat in silence, making no move to come closer, making no demands. When she had finished the first biscuit and started on the second, he spoke again. "My name is Marcus Hale," he said. "I have got a ranch about half a day's ride north of here. Plenty of room, plenty of food." He paused. "You can come with me if you want, or you can stay here. Your choice." Lena stopped chewing. She looked up at him, searching his face for the lie, the trick, the hidden trap. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me?" "Because you need help," he said simply, "and because I can give it." It was not enough. It was not nearly enough to explain why a stranger would stop for an abandoned child. But it was more than anyone had ever offered her before. Lena thought about her hollow beneath the rock, thought about the wolves she had heard in the night, thought about the berries that were not quite ripe and the endless empty days stretching out ahead of her with no one to help and nowhere to go. "Okay," she heard herself say. The word came out small and uncertain, barely louder than a whisper. "Okay, I will come with you." Marcus Hale nodded once, as if this was exactly what he had expected. He climbed down from his horse, a big chestnut mare with a white blaze on her forehead, and stood beside it, holding the reins. "You can ride in front," he said. "It is easier that way, unless you would rather walk." Lena shook her head. Walking meant falling behind, and falling behind meant being left again. She had done enough walking. He helped her up onto the horse, lifting her with an ease that suggested he was stronger than he looked, then swung up behind her. The saddle was wide enough for both of them, and Lena found herself surrounded by warmth, the warmth of the horse beneath her, the warmth of the man behind her, the warmth of the sun now fully risen above the trees. "Hold on to the saddle horn," Marcus said. "We will take it slow." The horse began to move, and Lena felt the trail sliding away beneath her, carrying her away from the place where she had been abandoned, towards something she did not yet understand. She did not know what waited for her at Marcus Hale's ranch. She did not know if she could trust him, or if this was just another temporary stop on the long road to nowhere. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope. The ranch appeared on the horizon like something out of a dream Lena had never dared to have. They had been riding for hours, the sun tracking its slow arc across the sky. The forest gave way to rolling grassland, and the grassland gave way to something else entirely. A valley so wide and green that it seemed to stretch all the way to the edge of the world. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the summer heat, and between them and the trail lay more land than Lena had ever seen in one place. In the center of it all, nestled against a gentle rise of earth, stood the house. It was bigger than anything she had imagined. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the afternoon light like eyes watching her approach. Behind it sprawled a barn, twice the size of the orphanage in Helena, and beyond that, fences stretched toward the horizon in neat, orderly lines, containing horses that moved like shadows across the grass. "This is yours." The words came out before Lena could stop them, small and disbelieving. "This is home," Marcus said simply. "Has been for 30 years. The horse carried them down the final stretch of trail and into the yard. A man emerged from the barn to meet them. He was younger than Marcus, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands. He looked at Lena with an expression of undisguised surprise. "Boss," he said, "taking the horse's reins. Did not expect you back until tomorrow, and you have brought someone." "Her name is Lena," Marcus said, swinging down from the saddle. He reached up and lifted her down after him, setting her on her feet with the same easy strength he had shown before. She will be staying with us for a while. See that a room is made up for her in the main house." The man's eyebrows rose, but he didn't argue. "Yes, sir. I will tell Rosa. Do that. And Tom." Marcus paused, his voice dropping low. "She has been through something. I do not know what yet, and I am not asking. But she is under my protection now. Make sure everyone understands that." Something passed between the two men, an understanding that Lena could not quite read but could feel in the air between them. "Understood, boss." Tom nodded slowly. "I will spread the word." Marcus turned back to Lena, and for the first time she saw something like gentleness in his weathered face. "Come on," he said. "Let us get you inside. Get some real food in you. Get you cleaned up." He started toward the house, and Lena followed. Because what else could she do? The porch steps creaked beneath her bare feet as she climbed them. The front door swung open before Marcus could reach it, and a woman appeared in the doorway. Middle-aged, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a face that looked like it had seen its share of hard years. "Mr. Hale," she said, and then her eyes fell on Lena and widened. "Oh my. Rosa, this is Lena. She needs a bath, a meal, and a bed. Not necessarily in that order." The woman Rosa looked from Marcus to Lena and back again. Something unspoken passed between them, and then Rosa's expression softened into something that might have been compassion. "Come here, child," she said, reaching out her hand. "Let us get you sorted out." Lena hesitated. She looked at Marcus, searching his face for some indication of what she should do. But he only nodded. "Go on," he said. "Rosa runs this house. She will take care of you." It was not trust that made Lena take Rosa's hand. It was exhaustion, bone deep and absolute, the kind that came from spending 2 days alone in the wilderness, with nothing but fear and determination to keep her alive. She was tired of being strong, tired of being vigilant, tired of carrying the weight of her own survival on shoulders that were never meant to bear it. So she let Rosa lead her into the house, through a hallway that smelled of wood smoke and something savory cooking, up a staircase that seemed to go on forever, and into a room that made her stop dead in her tracks. It was beautiful. A real bed stood against one wall, not a pile of grain sacks or a cot in the corner, but an actual bed with a metal frame and a mattress that looked thick and soft. A window looked out over the valley below, letting in the golden light of late afternoon. There was a dresser with a mirror, a wardrobe for clothes, a braided rug on the floor that was cleaner than anything Lena had ever been allowed to touch. "This is mine," she whispered. Rosa smiled, and for the first time Lena saw real warmth in another person's eyes. "This is yours, child, for as long as you need it." Lena stood in the doorway, unable to move. She had never had a room before, had never had a space that was hers alone, a door she could close, a place where she could exist without being watched or judged or measured against impossible standards. "I will draw you a bath," Rosa said gently, "and find you some clean clothes. You rest now. I will come get you when supper is ready." She left, and Lena was alone. For a long moment she just stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening. This morning she had woken up beneath a rock overhang with nothing but a handful of berries and the certainty of her own eventual death. Now she was standing in a room that was nicer than anything she had ever seen, in a house that belonged to a man she had met only hours ago, being offered food and shelter and safety by people who had no reason to care whether she lived or died. It did not make sense. None of it made sense. But the bed looked so soft, and she was so tired. Lena crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the mattress, half expecting it to disappear beneath her like a dream. It did not. It was real, solid and warm and impossibly comfortable. Before she knew what was happening, she was lying down, her head sinking into a pillow that smelled like lavender and clean linen. She meant to stay awake, meant to keep her guard up, stay alert for danger, be ready to run if this turned out to be another trap. But her body had other ideas. Within minutes, Lena Crow was asleep. She dreamed of wolves. They circled her in the darkness, their eyes glowing like embers, their breath hot against her skin. She tried to run, but her legs would not move. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The wolves drew closer, and she could feel their hunger, ancient and endless and patient, waiting for her to give up, to stop fighting, to become nothing. And then a voice cut through the darkness. "Wake up!" Lena's eyes snapped open. Rosa stood beside the bed, her hand on Lena's shoulder, her face creased with concern. The room was darker now. The golden light of afternoon had faded to the soft gray of twilight. "Easy, child," Rosa said. "You are safe." It was just a dream. Lena sat up slowly, her heart still racing, her hands trembling. The wolves were gone. The darkness was gone. She was in the beautiful room with the soft bed and the window overlooking the valley, and she was safe. Safe. The word felt foreign in her mind, like a language she had forgotten how to speak. "Supper is ready," Rosa said gently. "Can you walk, or do you need a minute?" "I can walk." Lena pushed herself to her feet, surprised to find that her legs were steady beneath her. "I am okay." Rosa looked at her with an expression that suggested she did not quite believe that. But she did not argue. "There is a bath waiting for you down the hall. Clean clothes on the chair. Take your time and come down when you are ready. Mr. Hale does not stand on ceremony." The bath was unlike anything Lena had ever experienced. A copper tub filled with hot water that steamed in the cool air, scented with something floral that made her head swim. She climbed in carefully, expecting the water to burn, but it was perfect, warm enough to soothe her aching muscles, hot enough to make her feel clean in a way she had not felt in months. She scrubbed away the dirt of the forest, the grime of the trail, the lingering residue of everything Martha Greer had put her through. And when she finally emerged from the tub, she felt like a different person. The clothes Rosa had left for her were simple but well made. A cotton dress in pale blue, a pair of thick socks, and shoes, real shoes. Lena stared at them for a long moment, remembering all the mornings she had walked barefoot through mud and frost because Martha had never seen fit to give her footwear. She put them on. They fit perfectly. And then she went downstairs to face whatever came next. The dining room was smaller than Lena had expected. Not the grand hall she had imagined, but a cozy space with a wooden table and chairs and a fireplace that crackled with warmth. Marcus sat at the head of the table. He looked up when she entered. "There you are," he said, "feeling better?" Lena nodded, not trusting her voice. "Sit down." He gestured to the chair beside him. "Rosa has made enough food to feed an army. Hope you are hungry." She was. She was so hungry that her stomach had stopped growling and settled into a kind of dull, constant ache. The kind that came from going too long without enough. But she sat down carefully, arranging herself in the chair with the precise, deliberate movements of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Marcus noticed. Of course he noticed. Lena was beginning to understand that this man noticed everything. But he did not comment. He just waited while Rosa brought out platters of food, roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and set them on the table between them. "Eat," Marcus said. "As much as you want. There is more where that came from." Lena stared at the food. There was more here than she would have eaten in a week at Martha's farm, more than she had seen in one place since the orphanage closed. She reached out slowly and took a piece of bread. It was warm, soft, fresh from the oven. She bit into it, and something inside her chest cracked open. A wall she had not known she was holding up, a defense she had not realized she needed. The bread tasted like heaven. It tasted like safety. It tasted like everything she had ever wanted and never been allowed to have. And before she could stop herself, she was crying. The tears came without warning and without permission, sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the table. Lena could not do anything to stop them. She sat there with the bread in her hand and her shoulders shaking, crying like she had not cried since her father died, like she had not cried in all the years since. Because crying was weakness, and weakness was dangerous, and she had never been allowed to be weak, but she could not stop. The tears kept coming. Wave after wave of grief and relief and something she could not name. "It is all right." His voice was gentle, quieter than she had ever heard it. "You are allowed to cry here. You are allowed to feel whatever you need to feel. No one is going to punish you for it." Lena looked up at him through her tears, searching for the lie. But his face was calm and open, and his eyes held nothing but patience. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Do not be." He pushed a cloth napkin across the table toward her. "When you have been through what you have been through, tears are the least of it. Just let them come. They will stop when they are ready." And they did. Eventually. Lena wiped her face with the napkin and took a shaky breath. "Better?" Marcus asked. She nodded. "Good. Now eat. And do not rush. We have got all the time in the world." They ate in silence for a while, and Lena found herself relaxing despite her best intentions. The food was good. Better than good. Better than anything she had ever tasted. And there was something about Marcus's presence that made her feel less alone. Finally, when Lena had eaten more than she thought her stomach could hold, Marcus set down his fork and looked at her. "I am not going to ask what happened to you," he said. "That is your story to tell, or not tell, as you choose. But I need you to understand something." Lena tensed, waiting for the condition, the price, the hidden cost of everything she had been given. "You are safe here," Marcus continued. "For as long as you want to stay, this is your home. No one is going to hurt you. No one is going to send you away, and no one is going to make you feel like you do not belong." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to so badly that it hurt, a physical ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the food she had eaten. But she had believed people before. She had trusted before. And every time without fail they had let her down. "Why?" she asked. The same question she had asked on the trail. And still the one she could not answer. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He stared out the window, and Lena saw something shift in his expression, a shadow of old pain quickly hidden. "I had a daughter," he said finally. "Not by blood. She came to us the way you came to me. Showed up at the ranch one day half-starved and running from something she never talked about. My wife, Catherine, she saw something in her. Took her in. Raised her like our own." He paused, and Lena waited, not daring to breathe. She died. Fever took her. Same fever that took Catherine 10 years ago. She was 16 years old, and she was the brightest thing this ranch had ever seen. He turned back to Lena, and his eyes were distant now, looking at something she could not see. "I could not save her, could not save either of them, but maybe." He shook his head. "I do not know. Maybe this is how I make it right. Maybe this is how I prove that all that loss meant something." It was not the answer Lena had expected. She had braced herself for conditions, for demands, for the inevitable strings attached to every gift she had ever been given. But this was something else entirely. This was grief. This was love. This was a man who had lost everything and was trying to find a way to live with it. "I am not her," Lena said quietly. "I am not your daughter. I am nobody. You are wrong." Marcus's voice was firm. "You are not nobody. You are a child who deserves a chance. And as long as you are under this roof, that is exactly what you are going to get." The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Lena woke each morning in her soft bed. still half expecting to find herself back beneath the rock overhang with the wolves howling in the distance. But each morning the room was the same, the sunlight streaming through the window, the smell of breakfast drifting up from downstairs, the quiet certainty that she was somewhere safe. It took time to believe it. Marcus did not push her. He did not make demands or set conditions or tell her what she was supposed to do. Instead, he gave her something she had never experienced before: space. The ranch has rules, he told her on that first morning. But they are not my rules, they are the land's rules. The horses need to be fed, the fences need to be mended, the cattle need to be moved before the summer heat sets in. Everyone here has a job to do, and everyone's work matters. He paused, watching her face. But you are not ready for that yet. Right now, your only job is to heal, to eat, to sleep, to remember what it feels like to be a child. She did not know what he meant by that. She had never felt like a child. Not really. Not even when she was small enough to fit in her father's arms. She had always been working, always been surviving, always been carrying weights that no child should have to carry. But she did not argue, and slowly, tentatively, she began to explore. The ranch was bigger than she had imagined. Thousands of acres of grassland and forest and mountain, crisscrossed with trails that seemed to go on forever. She walked for hours those first few days, following the fence lines, watching the horses, sitting by the creek that ran through the property and listening to the water sing over the stones. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going or what she was doing. No one watched her with suspicious eyes or counted the minutes she spent away from her chores. It was freedom, real freedom. And Lena did not know what to do with it. Rosa was kind to her. The older woman seemed to understand without being told that Lena was fragile in ways that did not show on the surface. She did not ask questions about where Lena had come from or what had happened to her. She simply fed her, clothed her, made sure she had everything she needed. "You remind me of someone," Rosa said one afternoon as Lena helped her shell peas in the kitchen. It was the first time Lena had offered to help with anything, and Rosa had accepted without comment, simply handing her a bowl and showing her what to do. "Who?" Lena asked. "Someone I knew a long time ago." Rosa's hands moved with practiced ease, splitting the pods and tumbling the peas into a waiting bowl. A girl who came to this ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back and more hurt in her eyes than anyone should have to carry. Lena's hands stilled. What happened to her? She healed. Rosa smiled, soft and sad. It took time, more time than anyone expected. But she healed, and when she left this ranch, she was whole again. She left. Everyone leaves eventually. That is the way of things. Rosa looked at her, and her eyes were gentle. But that does not mean the leaving has to hurt. Sometimes leaving is just the next part of the story. Lena thought about that for a long time afterward. A week passed, then two. The summer heat settled over the valley like a blanket, and Lena found herself falling into something like a routine. She woke early, before the sun was fully up, went to the kitchen to help Rosa with breakfast. She had discovered that she liked cooking, liked the rhythm of it, the way ingredients came together to become something nourishing and real. After breakfast, she walked. Sometimes she followed the fence lines. Sometimes she went to the barn and watched the horses, learning their names and their personalities and the way they moved when they were happy or scared or tired. And sometimes she spent time with Marcus. He was a quiet man, the kind who could sit for hours without speaking and not feel the need to fill the silence. But when he did speak, his words carried weight. He told her about the ranch, how he had built it from nothing, how he had fought for every acre, how he had buried his wife beneath the old oak tree on the hill and his daughter beside her. Loss is part of life, he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. You cannot escape it, cannot outrun it, can only learn to carry it. Lena pulled her knees up to her chest. How do you carry it? Same way you carry anything heavy. One step at a time. He looked at her, and his eyes were kind. You have been carrying a lot, have you not? She did not answer, but she did not look away either. I know what it is like, he continued, to feel like the world does not want you, like you are just taking up space, using up air, existing when you should not be. I know what it is like to wonder if anyone would notice if you disappeared. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had never said those words out loud, had barely allowed herself to think them. But here is the thing, Marcus said. Those feelings are liars. They tell you that you are worthless, but they are wrong. They tell you no one cares, but they are wrong about that too. You matter because you are alive, and being alive is enough. Is it? The words came out before she could stop them. Is it really enough? It is a start. He turned back to the sunset, and his voice was soft. Give it time, the rest will follow. 3 weeks into her stay at the ranch, Lena met the horses. Not just saw them from a distance the way she had been doing, but really met them, up close, with Marcus beside her and a lead rope in her hand. This is Bella, Marcus said, introducing her to a bay mare with soft eyes and a gentle temperament. She has been on this ranch longer than most of the people, raised her from a foal. Lena reached out tentatively, her fingers hovering just above the mare's nose. Bella snorted softly and pushed her muzzle into Lena's palm, her whiskers tickling the sensitive skin. She likes you, Marcus observed. How can you tell? She is not trying to bite you. A rare smile crossed his face. That is Bella's version of approval. Over the following days, Lena learned to care for the horses. She learned how to brush their coats and check their hooves and measure out their feed. She learned to read their body language. The flick of an ear that meant attention. The swish of a tail that meant annoyance. The soft nicker that meant trust. And slowly she learned to ride. Keep your heels down, Marcus instructed, walking beside her as Bella plodded around the corral. Relax your shoulders. You are stiff as a fence post. I am trying not to fall off. You will not fall off. Bella would not let you. He reached up and adjusted her grip on the reins. Trust her. She knows what she's doing, even if you do not. Trust. That word again. It kept coming up, over and over, like a lesson she was supposed to be learning. Lena tried. She loosened her death grip on the saddle horn. She let her shoulders drop. She took a deep breath and allowed her body to move with Bella's rhythm instead of fighting against it. And something shifted. The fear did not disappear. It never completely disappeared. But it faded into the background, replaced by something else. Exhilaration, maybe. Or freedom. The wind in her hair. The horse beneath her. The endless sky above. It felt like flying without leaving the ground. There you go, Marcus said, and there was approval in his voice. You are a natural. 1 month after Marcus found her on that forest trail, Lena finally told him her story. They were sitting on the porch again, watching the stars come out one by one. The night was warm and the valley was quiet, and something about the darkness made it easier to speak. Her name was Martha, Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha Greer. She took me in after the orphanage closed. Marcus did not respond. He just listened, his presence steady and solid beside her. She needed help on the farm. That is why she took me. Not because she wanted a daughter, not because she cared about me, just because I was young and strong enough to work. Lena's hands twisted in her lap. I did everything she asked. Everything. I worked harder than anyone, ate less than anyone, never complained, never asked for anything. I thought if I was good enough, if I was useful enough, maybe she would keep me. She trailed off. The sentence did not need to be finished. This summer the crops failed. She continued. The wells started running dry, money got tight, and Martha decided she could not afford to keep feeding me anymore. So she took me out to the forest and left me there. Just left me, like I was nothing, like I was garbage she could not be bothered to dispose of properly. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she did not cry. She had cried enough. She just wanted to get the words out. I waited, she said. I waited for her to come back. I knew she would not. I knew. But I waited anyway. Because that is what you do when you are nothing. You wait for someone to decide you are worth something after all. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything Lena had said and everything she had not. Finally, Marcus spoke. You are not nothing. His voice was rough, like the words were hard for him to say. You hear me. You are not garbage. You are not disposable. You are not dead weight or a burden or any of the other lies they told you. Lena shook her head. You do not understand. I have been abandoned before. This was not the first time. It will not be the last. People look at me and they see something wrong, something broken, something not worth keeping. Then they are blind. Marcus turned to face her, and his eyes were fierce in the starlight. I have seen a lot of people in my life, Lena, good people and bad people and everything in between. And I have never met anyone who was not worth something, not one single person. What about the bad ones, the ones who hurt people? Even them. They made choices, wrong choices. But they started out the same as everyone else, just people doing their best with what they had. He paused. The difference is in what you do with your pain. Some people let it make them cruel. Some people let it make them stronger. Lena looked down at her hands. Which one am I? She asked quietly. That is up to you. Marcus's voice softened. But I know which one I think you are. It was Marcus who first suggested she choose a new name. They were in the barn, mucking out stalls, when he brought it up. Lena had taken to helping with the morning chores, finding comfort in the routine and the physical labor. There was something satisfying about work that had nothing to do with survival, work that was just work, honest and simple and real. Crow, Marcus said, leaning on his pitchfork. That is the name they gave you at the orphanage. Lena nodded. I do not remember my mother's name. My father was Thomas. But I do not know if Crow was his real name or just something they put on a piece of paper. Do you like it? The name. She had never thought about it before. The name had simply been hers, a label attached to her without her input or consent. But now that Marcus asked, she realized that she had never felt any connection to it. Crow, it sounded dark, harsh. It sounded like something you would call a bird that fed on the dead. I do not know, she said honestly. I have never thought about it. Well, think about it now. Marcus resumed his shoveling. A name is important. It is how the world sees you. And more than that, it is how you see yourself. What would I choose instead? Whatever feels right. He glanced at her, and there was something warm in his eyes. You have got time. No rush. Lena thought about it for days. It was not until a week later, sitting by the creek where she had first heard the wolves howl, that the answer came to her. She had been watching the water flow over the rocks, mesmerized by the way it caught the light and turned it into diamonds, and she had thought about all the things she wanted to be, all the things she was learning to believe she could be, strong, brave, worthy. And then she thought about the mountains that rose in the distance, their peaks eternal and unchanging. She thought about how they had been there for millions of years, standing tall through storms and earthquakes and the slow erosion of time. Stone. She wanted to be like stone. Lena Stone, she said out loud, testing the words on her tongue. They felt solid, real. They felt like something she could grow into. She told Marcus that night at dinner. Stone, he repeated, turning the name over in his mind. Lena Stone. He nodded slowly. I like it. You do. I do. It suits you. Strong. Steady. Hard to break. Lena smiled. A real smile. one that reached her eyes and stayed there. "Lena Stone," she said again, and for the first time in her life, her name felt like it belonged to her. Winter passed. Spring came, and slowly, gradually, life resumed its rhythm. Lena was different now. She was taller, stronger, her body finally catching up to the years of neglect it had endured. But the real growth was happening somewhere deeper, in places she could not see or measure. She was learning to trust, learning to hope, learning to believe that the people around her were not going to disappear the moment she let her guard down. It was terrifying, but it was also wonderful. Marcus taught her everything he knew about the land. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find water in places that looked bone dry, how to track animals through the snow. He taught her the names of the mountains that surrounded the valley, the history of the trails that crisscrossed the property, the stories of the people who had lived and died on this land long before either of them was born. "This ranch is not just dirt and grass," he told her one afternoon as they rode the fence line together. "It is memory. Every acre has a story. Every hill remembers something." Lena looked out over the valley, trying to see what he saw. "What does this hill remember?" "This is where I asked Catherine to marry me." Marcus's voice was soft, touched with old grief and older love. 40 years ago, almost to the day, we were young and foolish and did not have two nickels to rub together. But I knew the moment I saw her that I wanted to spend my life with her. And she said yes. A smile crossed his weathered face. "Best decision I ever made. Best decision she ever made, too, I think." Lena was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss her?" "Every day." Marcus did not hesitate. "Every single day. But missing her does not mean I stopped living. Catherine would not have wanted that." It was late August when the riders came. Lena was in the south pasture, checking on a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, when she saw them approaching. 3 men on horseback, moving fast along the main trail, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the hot summer air like smoke. Something about them made her uneasy. She finished her work quickly and rode back toward the main house. Arriving just as the strangers were dismounting in the yard, Marcus was already there, standing on the porch with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Rosa hovered in the doorway behind him, her face tight with worry. "Mr. Hale." The lead rider tipped his hat, but there was no respect in the gesture. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Been a while." "Garrett." Marcus's voice was flat. "Did not expect to see you again. Life is full of surprises." The man Garrett let his eyes wander over the property, taking in the barn, the corral, the horses grazing in the distance. "Place looks good. You have done well for yourself. I have worked hard. There is a difference." "Is there?" Garrett smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "The way I see it, you have got more than your share. More land than any one man needs. More cattle. More everything." His gaze settled on Marcus with predatory intensity. "My father never got over losing that south section to you. Ate at him until the day he died. Your father lost that land fair and square. He bet it in a card game and he lost. That is not my fault. Maybe not. But here's the thing." Garrett stepped forward, and his men moved with him, flanking him like wolves around a pack leader. "I do not care about fair. I care about what is mine, and the way I see it, that south section should have stayed in my family. You are not getting that land, Garrett." Marcus's voice was hard as iron. "Not today. Not ever. Your father made his choices, and those choices have consequences. That is how the world works. The world works however the strong decide it works." Garrett's smile widened. "And right now I am the strong one. I have got men. I have got resources." His eyes flickered toward Lena. noticing her for the first time, and something ugly crossed his face. What is this? You have got yourself a little orphan now. Lena felt the words like a physical blow. Orphan. The word she had carried with her for so long. The label that marked her as unwanted and discarded. Her name is Lena, Marcus said, and there was a warning in his voice that made Garrett's men shift uneasily. And she is none of your concern. Everything on this ranch is my concern. Garrett turned back to Marcus, dismissing Lena as easily as he might dismiss a fly. Here is what is going to happen. You are going to sign over the south section. The papers are already drawn up. All you have to do is put your name on them, and we will be on our way. And if I refuse, then things get complicated. Garrett's voice dropped, taking on a tone of menace that made the hair on Lena's arms stand up. I have got lawyers. I have got connections. I can make your life very difficult, Hale. Drag you through courts until you are buried in debt. Challenge your land claims going back generations. By the time I am done with you, you will not have a ranch left to defend. The threat hung in the air like poison. Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and utterly unyielding. Get off my land. Garrett blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Get off my land. Take your men and your threats and your papers, and do not come back. This conversation is over. For a moment, Garrett looked genuinely surprised, like a man who had expected an easy victory and found a stone wall instead. Then his expression hardened, and the mask of civility dropped away entirely. You are making a mistake, Hale. Maybe. But it is my mistake to make. Marcus uncrossed his arms and stepped down from the porch, putting himself directly in front of Garrett. Despite the age difference, despite the fact that Garrett was bigger and younger and had 2 armed men at his back, Marcus did not flinch. This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, he said, his voice low and fierce. I built it with my own hands. I buried my wife here. I buried my daughter here. Every inch of this land has been soaked in my sweat and my blood and my tears. And you think you can walk in here with some piece of paper and take it from me? He stepped closer, until he and Garrett were almost nose to nose. Try it, Marcus said. Try it and see what happens. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Garrett laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You have got spine, old man. I will give you that. He stepped back, adjusting his hat. But spine will not save you when the lawyers come. We will be back, and next time I will not be so polite. He swung back onto his horse, and his men followed. Within moments they were riding away, their dust trail marking their passage like a scar across the land. Marcus watched them go, his jaw set and his fists clenched. Lena approached slowly. Marcus, she said softly, are you okay? The Garrett family has been a thorn in my side for 30 years, he said, his voice weary. Jacob Garrett, that man's father, was my neighbor back when I was just starting out. We used to be friends, believe it or not. Then came the card game and the land, and suddenly we were enemies. He died 5 years ago, bitter and broken and convinced that everything that went wrong in his life was my fault. Marcus shook his head. Now his son is picking up where he left off. And he is more dangerous than his father ever was. What are we going to do? Marcus looked at her, really looked, taking in the fear in her eyes and the determination underneath it. We, he repeated. You said we. Lena had not realized she had said it until he pointed it out. But it was true. This was not just Marcus's fight anymore. It was hers too. This is my home, she said, and saying it out loud made it feel more real than ever before. I am not going to let anyone take it away. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. The weariness faded, replaced by something fiercer, something that looked like hope. "Then we fight," he said. "Together. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The attack came on a moonless night in early September, when the darkness was so complete that Lena could not see her hand in front of her face. She woke to the sound of shouting and the smell of smoke. The barn was on fire. By the time she reached the yard, chaos had erupted. Ranch hands were running everywhere, hauling buckets of water from the well, trying to contain flames that had already consumed the south wall of the barn. The horses were screaming, a sound Lena had never heard before and never wanted to hear again. And Marcus was in the thick of it, directing the firefighting effort with a voice that cut through the pandemonium like a blade. "The horses!" he shouted. "Get the horses out! Everything else can be replaced!" Lena did not hesitate. She ran toward the barn, ignoring the heat that scorched her skin and the smoke that seared her lungs. She found Bella first. The mare was wild-eyed with terror, her coat already singed, her hooves striking sparks from the stone floor as she fought to escape. Lena grabbed her halter and held on, using every ounce of strength she had to drag the horse toward the doors. "Come on," she gasped. "Come on, Bella, please." The mare resisted for one terrible moment, then seemed to recognize Lena's voice and allowed herself to be led. They burst out of the barn together, and Lena handed Bella off to one of the ranch hands before turning back. There were more horses inside, more lives to save. She did not know how many trips she made, did not know how many horses she pulled from the flames. All she knew was the heat and the smoke and the desperate need to keep moving, to keep fighting, to not let the fire win. It was Tom who finally pulled her away. "Lena, stop." He grabbed her arm and dragged her back from the burning building. "The roof is coming down. You cannot go back in there." "But there are still more. We got them out. We got them all out." His face was streaked with soot and sweat, but his eyes were clear. "You did good, kid. You did real good." The roof collapsed moments later, sending a pillar of flame and sparks shooting into the sky. They had saved the horses. They had saved the cattle. They had saved each other. But the barn was gone. "This was arson," Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Garrett did this. The ranch was rebuilt, stronger than before. Word spread through the valley, and help arrived from neighboring ranches. Men with tools and timber, women with food and comfort, the kind of practical compassion that did not need to be named." 3 weeks later, the new barn stood complete. It was during the celebration that night that Marcus called Lena into his study. "There is something I want to talk to you about," he said. His voice was serious. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her, and she opened it with trembling fingers. It was a map of the ranch, hand-drawn and detailed. But there was something different about it, something that made her breath catch in her throat. In the corner, written in Marcus's careful handwriting, were 3 words: "Lena's section south." "That is the south pasture," Marcus said. "The land Garrett wants so badly. I am giving it to you." Lena stared at him. "I do not understand. It is simple. The land is yours. Legally, officially yours. I have already talked to the lawyer. She is drawing up the papers." He met her eyes, and his expression was fierce. "Garrett thinks he can take what does not belong to him. He thinks he can bully and burn and threaten his way to what he wants. I want him to know that even if something happened to me, the land would still be protected, still be in the hands of someone who deserves it." "Marcus, I cannot accept this. You can and you will." His voice softened. "This is not charity, Lena. This is recognition. Recognition of who you are and what you have become. You have earned this. Every inch of it." 3 days later, Garrett returned. He came alone this time. Marcus was in town. Only Lena was home. "Where is Hale?" Garrett demanded. "Mr. Hale is in town." Lena's voice was steady. "He will not be back until tomorrow." Garrett looked at her, really looked for the first time. "You are the orphan," he said. "The stray he picked up. My name is Lena Stone, and I am not a stray. You are nothing." The word was a weapon designed to wound. "You are nobody. A piece of trash someone threw away and another fool decided to keep." Once those words would have destroyed her. Once she would have crumbled under the weight of them, but that was before. Before Marcus, before the ranch, before she learned what it meant to belong somewhere. "I am the owner of the South Section," Lena said. "The land you want so badly. It is mine now, legally and officially, and I am not giving it up." Garrett's face went red. "You think a piece of paper changes anything?" He snarled. "You think owning land makes you somebody? You are still the same worthless orphan you have always been. The same nothing." "Maybe." Lena's voice was quiet but fierce. "But this nothing is standing on her own land, looking you in the eye, and telling you to leave. So which one of us is really worth nothing?" For a moment she thought he might strike her, but something in her expression made him stop. "This is not over," he said finally. "Maybe not, but today it is." Lena pointed toward the gate. "That is the way out. I suggest you use it." Garrett stared at her for a long moment. Then he mounted his horse and rode away. Lena watched him go, her heart pounding, but her hand steady. She had done it. She had stood her ground against the man who wanted to take everything from her, and she had not backed down. Months later, Marcus told her about his heart. "My time is limited," he said simply. "Could be years, could be months. I need to know that when I am gone, you will be ready." He handed her adoption papers. "If you agree to it, if you want it, I would like to make you my legal daughter, my heir, the one who inherits this ranch when I am gone." Lena felt tears burning in her eyes. "Why me?" "Because you are the daughter I never expected to have. The family I thought I had lost forever." "Yes," Lena said. "I want to be your daughter. Lena Stone Hale." That became her name, and for the first time in her life, she truly belonged. 5 years passed. Marcus died peacefully one November morning, with Lena holding his hand, with snow falling outside the window, with love surrounding him. Lena mourned, but she did not break. She had promised him she would carry on, and she kept that promise. The ranch prospered under her leadership. She expanded the cattle operation, built new barns, hired more hands, turned a prosperous ranch into a thriving empire. But her greatest achievement was not measured in acres or cattle, it was measured in lives. Molly was the first, a 7-year-old girl Lena found in a ravine, abandoned by a family who could not afford to keep her. Just like Lena had been abandoned all those years ago. Lena took her in, gave her food and shelter and love, gave her the same chance Marcus had given her. And Molly flourished. Then came others, children who showed up at the ranch the same way Lena and Molly had. Lost, abandoned, convinced they were nothing. Lena took them all in, one by one, giving them the same thing Marcus had given her, a chance. It was a summer evening, golden and warm. When Lena finally understood the full weight of what she had inherited, she was standing at the gate, looking out over the valley she had come to know better than her own heartbeat. Molly stood beside her, 15 years old now, tall and strong and fierce. "Do you remember the day Papa found you?" Molly asked. "Every detail," Lena smiled. "I was standing on a trail, covered in dirt, holding a handful of crumbs that were supposed to last me 2 days. I thought I was going to die out there, and now look at you." Molly gestured at the ranch behind them. "You built all this. We built it. All of us together." Lena was quiet for a moment. "You know what I have learned," she said softly, "in all these years, through everything that has happened?" "What?" That being left behind is not the end of the story. It is just the beginning. She turned to look at her sister. Every single person who abandoned me, my mother, my father, the orphanage, Martha Greer, they all thought they were throwing away garbage, something worthless, something that did not matter. Her voice grew stronger. But they were wrong. They were all wrong. Because the thing about being thrown away is that it teaches you something. It teaches you that your worth does not come from other people. It comes from you, from what you choose to do with the life you have been given. She looked back at the valley. Marcus did not save me, she said. He gave me the chance to save myself. And that is what I am trying to do for everyone who comes through these gates. Not rescue them, but show them that they are worth saving, that they matter, that they belong. As the sun began to set, a figure appeared at the gate. A boy, maybe 12 years old, thin and dirty and alone, looking at the ranch house with hope and fear and desperate longing. The same expression Lena had worn all those years ago. She walked toward him, slowly, gently. "Hi there," she said. "My name is Lena. I live here." The boy did not respond. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "We have food, warm beds, people who care." Still nothing. "You can come with me if you want," Lena continued, "or you can stay out here. It is your choice. But I want you to know something. Whatever happened to you, wherever you came from, it does not define you. It does not determine your worth. You matter. You belong. And there is a place for you here if you want it." She held out her hand. The boy stared at it, stared at her face, stared at the ranch house with its warm lights and welcoming windows. And then slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took it. Lena smiled. "Welcome home," she said. And together they walked toward the light. The girl who had once been left on a trail to die was now the woman who opened her doors to the lost and broken and thrown away. Because home was not a place you were born into. It was a place you built, a place you earned, a place you shared with the people who chose to love you and the people you chose to love in return. And Lena Stonehale had the biggest, warmest, most beautiful home in the entire world, not because of the land or the cattle or the money, but because of the family, the legacy, the love, the proof that nobody was ever truly nothing. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.